From the Foundation Studio right here on Biloxi's Back Bay, welcome to SuperTalk Outdoors, where, as we remind you every single week, we're going to celebrate Mississippi's great outdoors at lunchtime here on every single Monday, and we appreciate you joining us. I keep hearing from people from all across the state, and man, there's some people who are passionate about the outdoors, and I love hearing from you. So I really appreciate you listening and following this show. I want to thank you for joining us on the powerful SuperTalk Mississippi Network, or on SuperTalk TV at C Spire TV. But if you're listening on Facebook or YouTube or your favorite podcast, it's February the 21st, 2022. My son Jordan's birthday, incidentally. So happy birthday, JoJo, as we call him. I was asked to come up to Jackson last week I had an opportunity to address. They asked me to be the speaker for the night at the annual Sportsman's Caucus for the Mississippi Legislature. And it was extremely well attended. I saw a bunch of old friends from my son Harold days and made some new friends. Was really surprised to hear how many people paid attention to the show. It's always great to sort of get in a group like that of passionate outdoorsmen and women, and have a connection with them. But the show's touching a lot of people, and so many of them are paying attention as well. But I'm also reminded that when we're in the outdoors together, it doesn't really matter what your political affiliation is. We're one Mississippi, as my friend Steve Azar says in the opening song. We are definitely just one Mississippi. I was delighted to have some amazing catfish, I might add. The Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks, they've got that down to a science. And the fixings that came with the dinner were also just amazing. So overall, it was a great evening, and I had the honor of sharing my passion for Mississippi's outdoors. And I told him what I say to you every week on this show, that I'm going to leave the politics of the legislature up to my friends Paul Gallo and Gerard. But from time to time, we're going to talk about why what happens in Jackson at our state capitol matters to outdoorsmen and women. And one of those matters that I talked about was the same thing that I've continued to talk about here on SuperTalk Outdoors, is the Outdoor Stewardship Trust Fund. 2 weeks ago, we had a terrific conversation with the Secretary of State, Michael Watson. He's so focused on bringing this diverse group of people together from all sectors of conservation to develop and formulate a plan for conservation in Mississippi. Really appreciate his leadership, and I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And then last week I had Representative Trey Lamar and Agricultural and Commerce Commissioner Andy Gibson, and we talked about the Outdoor Stewardship Trust Fund from their point of view, and they were both extremely passionate, terrific conversations. If you missed those conversations, incidentally, you can go back to the Facebook page, SuperTalk Mississippi Facebook page, SuperTalk Outdoors YouTube page. You can get it in so many different ways. I listen to Spotify. You can go to Spotify, search SuperTalk Outdoors. It will pop up. You can listen to it that way. Again, however you want it, this show is available to you. But those were great conversations. But as it relates to the Outdoor Stewardship Trust Fund, if you love the outdoors, if you really, really love the outdoors, you're going to love this fund. And I've often referred to it as generational legislation. It got a little hung up in the Senate last year, and I'll talk to you more about that in a second. But as a result, we missed another year of federal matching funds. And you're going to hear us talk today, hear me talk a lot today, about this whole notion of federal matching funds, because that's where a lot of the big dollars are, and that's why it's important for us to have a dedicated fund. But we've got to invest in our outdoors. I think most people at least understand that. They may disagree on how to best do that, but the opportunity for us to create and enhance wildlife habitat in our state for generations to come is there's so many opportunities, but it takes money to do that, and we can match state money with federal money, and I think make a huge difference. But unfortunately, here we are again, where we've got the Senate and the House, at least in terms of the bills they passed that have passed each of those chambers. They seem, at least at this point, pretty far apart on how to best address this. There's going to be a lot going on in the legislature this year. I refer to it as noise. It's probably one of the most consequential legislative sessions since the special sessions that followed Hurricane Katrina. That is for sure. Some of the most important legislation in our state's history happened after Hurricane Katrina. But this is important. This is an important legislative session, and there are a lot of competing objectives. So there's a lot of noise as a result of that. So what I'm hoping is that conservation leaders are able to focus on the Conservation Trust Fund in the coming days, because the next few days is when a lot of the rubber is going to hit the road as it relates to this. There's some positive signs that I'm seeing. First of all, there's a growing number of legislative and conservation leaders across the state who understand that creating this fund is going to help significantly strengthen our investment in Mississippi's outdoors. And as I continue to say, and I will just drive this point home, it will enable major league matching fund opportunities on the federal level. So the House version of this bill is going to commit a percentage of existing sales tax from sporting goods to the fund. This is called a sales tax diversion. In the House version, this would actually grow to about $15 million a year by year 3. Having the trust fund will enable Mississippi to capture significant federal, and I might also add private matching funds. I often cite the example of Georgia. They made a $20 million investment and grew it to nearly $100 million. So clearly, the money we invest will be paid back in significant ways. But we've got to have a dedicated funding source in order to get the majority of the federal funds that are available to us. In other words, without the matching funds from the state, for the most part, we're dead in the water in terms of the federal funds currently available to us. This is a really important point to make. As a result of not having that fund now, we're missing out on some matching opportunities, very significant matching opportunities. Okay, the last year, the bill to create the trust fund overwhelmingly passed the House 117-2. This year, 2 versions of the bill essentially passed the bill. They're essentially the same. The House 117-4. On the Senate side, last year, Senate Lieutenant Governor Delbert Hosemann triple referred the bill. Triple referring a bill, just for those who don't know the term, essentially the same thing as saying that he doomed the bill to death. But there was some wrangling that took place in the Senate that enabled the bills to get out of the 3 committees, but it was a stripped-down version. What made it to the full Senate, and I've referred to in the past as essentially a toothless bill, it would not allow the trust fund to be spent on private land. And now, with more than 80% of the land in Mississippi being private land, you can't have a viable statewide conservation effort if you don't include private land. This issue was settled a long, long time ago, and we can thank Senator Thad Cochran for his leadership on something specific. It was, obviously Thad Cochran was an incredible leader for our state for many years, but the Farm Bill created incredible programs, some of the most successful programs in our nation's history, and programs like the CRP program and WRP program. And that involves, the Farm Bill, that is, involves 100% private land. Now, Thad Cochran's legacy continues to live on. As Secretary of State Michael Watson and I discussed on the show, as he continues to work on efforts to map out a conservation plan that includes a wide range of conservation leaders, from state and federal government to private sector, from non-governmental entities like Nature Conservancy, Wildlife Mississippi, Ducks Unlimited, they all concluded that in order for us to have a viable statewide program, you got to include all the stakeholders. You want their ideas. You want their best practices. You want them to look around the nation to find out who's doing this stuff well, who's being innovative. You need their passion for conservation. And by the way, you need their significant experience in going after federal funds. That is for sure. But the Senate version last year took out non-governmental organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Wildlife Mississippi, and Ducks Unlimited. They said they cannot apply for funds. So I asked this last year, and I had the same question again this year. Why wouldn't you include conservation experts who do this for a living? Why wouldn't you include their innovative efforts and their experience that they have gained from working in other states? And there is no dedicated funding source in the Senate version. The program will have to wait for annual legislative appropriations. But consider this. Most conservation efforts take years to fully implement and appreciate. How can you do multi-year conservation projects if you don't have dedicated funding? There's so many questions. I could spend the rest of the show talking about it. But last year, Delbert Hosemann made it clear he opposed the diversion in tax revenue from the sale of sporting goods. He opposed using trust money for private land, and he opposed involving non-governmental organizations. The Senate bill ultimately last year addressed his concerns, and their bill this year is sort of the same. So when we come back on the other side, I want to share with you some of the couple of the really positive efforts that I've seen happening in the last week or so that I think bodes well for maybe where we're headed with this. And then I'm going to ask some of my friends from the Nature Conservancy, Wildlife Mississippi, and Ducks Unlimited to join me. And we're going to continue the conversation and talk a little bit more about where we can go from here and just kind of talk about why this is important for Mississippi. We'll see you after this break. Welcome back to Super Talk Outdoors. And let me say this, if you're driving along in your pickup truck or just enjoying sort of a break during lunch, sorry to be talking so much about legislative activities, but if you love hunting or fishing or canoeing or anything else as it relates to the outdoors in Mississippi, you got to pay attention to this conversation, because the Conservation Trust Fund legislation that's in front of the legislature as we speak is generationally important to our enjoyment of the outdoors. And so I'm going to stay focused on it until we get this thing passed. So when I left off, I was talking about the difference between the Senate and the House bills. And I want to tell you where we are now. The two bills that have been the two bills in the Senate have been single referred this year. So there's no triple referral. That in itself, by the way, is a really good move. Okay. So it's been sent over to Chairman Neil Whaley's committee. And Neil is the chairman of Wildlife Fisheries and Parks Committee on the Senate side. And so now the fate of the trust fund, the Conservation Trust Fund, is in Senator Neil Whaley's hands. So one committee, both bills from the House are in that committee. That's where the rubber is going to hit the road, and we're going to follow closely how Neil Whaley leads this conversation going forward. I also hear that there were some excellent meetings last week between the Senate and House Wildlife Fisheries and Parks committees with chairman on the Senate side, like I mentioned, Neil Whaley, and also Representative Bill Kincaid from the House side, and some conservation leaders. And I also have heard that there's been some good dialogue and questions coming from the Lieutenant Governor's office. So it feels already at this stage of the game that it's different this year. We shall soon see over the coming days. I do sense progress, and I hope I'm right about that. But I should also mention that there was a story recently by Taylor Vance in the Daily Journal that says that Lieutenant Governor intends to fix state parks first before they move in this direction. Let me give you the exact quote from the Lieutenant Governor. I think all of our discussions in the Senate has been about the fact that we believe the state's parks ought to be fixed first before we start fixing private land. Well, there's really nothing to fix on the private land side. Let me point that out first, because what we're trying to do is across state and federal lands to create wildlife habitat and other projects that enhance conservation in Mississippi. But that's his position. He said that was our position last year, and I don't see that changing this year. So that was his comment. So let me get back over here and just say this, that I think a lot of people know that we have some work to do in our state parks, but conservation efforts in this state don't have to wait for state parks to get fixed. Why? Those are not mutually exclusive. We can do both of these things. But to think that we're going to hold up conservation efforts until we fix state parks, I don't know why we're talking that way. And I hope we're not now. Okay, like I said, there's been projects even since this story ran. So I know that Delbert Hosemann is a conservation leader. He's proven that in the past. I hope he now sees moving this legislation forward creates for him a conservation legacy like nothing he's ever done before. So we're hoping that we're going to get his leadership on this effort, and I'm really looking forward to it. I've actually asked Senator Neil Whaley to join me, or will ask him to join me on the show next week. And also we're going to be joined by Will Primos. Will has been super passionate about this issue. So I'm hoping that that we've got some great news to share next Monday about movements that have happened that will really enable Mississippi to stay the capital of the outdoors in the U.S. and that we can pass the Outdoor Stewardship Trust Fund. So it is landmark legislation. I'm passionate about it. I hope that you're getting passionate about it. I hope that, you know, these conversations that we're having here on Super Talk Outdoors helps you understand why we need to focus on this. So without any further ado, let me bring a terrific group of guys into the conversation, and we're going to talk more about all of this here. I've got James from Wildlife Mississippi, Alex from the Nature Conservancy, and Ed from Ducks Unlimited. Hey guys, how you doing?
Good morning.
So James Cummings, let's come to you first. You heard the comment about fixing the state parks first. Honestly, you've written the book on conservation efforts. You've written the book on private lands and how they have to be part of a viable conservation effort. Capital projects that we would do on state parks, that's not really conservation. My thought is they probably ought to spin that off and go fix those things with the federal money they've got available to us, and not confuse that with the kind of conservation efforts that we're talking about today. What do you think about that?
So I certainly agree that they need to be fixed. I mean, in fact, we lost a year by not getting the bill passed last year if it was going to include parks in private land. So we're already a year behind. You know, as we celebrate President's Day, I'm obviously thinking about Theodore Roosevelt, but I'm also thinking about Ronald Reagan and what a great president he was. And Reagan only created one national park. He created a lot of access to existing public lands, but he also created the largest private lands program in our nation's history, and that's the Conservation Reserve Program in 1985. That program, since its inception, has pumped $1.1 billion into Mississippi. The Wetland Reserve Program, another, you've talked about Senator Cochran, one of Thad's legacies, is that's a $500 million program. You know, and I'm sitting here thinking, as we're all talking and listening to you about what we're taxed, we're not even taxing the conservation monies that are coming in the state. We're not counting that toward this. But, you know, yes, I agree, you know, to your point, we've got to look at taking care of the things that we bought, whether it be fixing invasive species on wildlife management areas, you know, whether it be, you know, fixing state parks. We've got to have a comprehensive program. You know, if I'm a farmer and I have boll weevils in my field, I don't treat 20% of my field. I treat all of it, you know, whether it's wild hogs or whatever it is. And that's what we're trying to say is let's have a comprehensive program for Mississippi. You talked about leveraging. You know, there's $74 billion in the infrastructure bill. You know, if we miss another year, we're going to miss a big piece of that because that's a one-year deal, a one and done. You know, so anyway, I don't know that you ever completely get finished fixing parks. I have a house, I have a cabin. I'm fortunate enough to have a cabin. I'm always fixing on them. I don't know when that's done, but you know, I do think there's one thing that you know, whether it's Ed or Alec with DU, you know, or Ed with DU and Alec with TNC, we all met last week, and if there's one thing that comes across clearly is the passion that our elected leaders have for conservation. And I'm confident that we're going to be working toward a solution. And I'll shut up there. I've already talked too long, but
no, those are all really relevant points. And you wrote the book on this. You're widely read, nationally known conservation leader, and your point of view. In fact, you're here in Mississippi, and that we're fortunate to have you. Alex, coming over to you. One of the things, you know, Nature Conservancy has been involved in all kinds of efforts, you know, creating WMAs, you know, the wildlife management areas. You've been involved in so many conservation efforts, but more recently, actually, you were involved in this sort of stakeholder analysis that was put together by the Secretary of State to look at the situation. And at the, you know, sort of at the basis of this is the fact that wildlife don't know property lines, and it's just important for us to focus on wildlife habitat and WMAs and then government-owned land as it is in private land. But you have to do both in concert with one another to have a truly viable program. What are your thoughts about that?
I'm really kind of flinching a little bit because I can see my dad, if I came in and I just bush hogged 20% of the field growing up, I can tell you how that would go down. Oh, it would not be pretty. But as I told Ed and James last week in these meetings we had, and in these discussions, it's really a remarkable time in Mississippi's history to have the available funding to address the needs, infrastructure needs at state parks with the federal money we have, but to also at the same time have the support and the backing and the polling that we know is out there that says, hey, we can go invest in our WMAs, we can go invest in our national wildlife refuges, we can go invest in our national forest, our state forest, and comprehensive private lands program. I mean, you're talking about something that I dare say James probably thought was unimaginable at one point in time, and here we sit today with the ability at our fingertips to do that. So,
Yeah.
you know, in Secretary Michael Watson's analysis, and James and Ed were a part of that too. His group was real unique in that it participants were both federal and state conservation and natural resource agencies, charitable conservation groups like DU, TNC, and Wildlife Mississippi. And then we had some private individuals that do conservation easement work and on the ground field work and monitoring. And 80% of us said, this is the most foundational piece that we need. This is the greatest lever you can pull in order to have the greatest impact for conservation. So I'm excited, and I mean, it's really, we're on the cusp of it. It's at our fingertips, and you know, I'm excited to see what's going to happen.
One of the most significant challenges we face in the state, it's just a reality, is the loss of habitat. And when we come back, I want to talk with Ed Penny from Ducks Unlimited to talk about why this is an important conversation for us, and these efforts can actually help us address it. We'll see you after this break. Welcome back to SuperTalk Outdoors. We're having a really detailed conversation because we're at a really critical point in the juncture as it relates to the Mississippi legislature and this Outdoor Stewardship Trust Fund that I have talked about numerous times on this show, and we'll continue to talk about it and I hope it's educating you and making you passionate about the kind of things that Mississippi's got to do if we're going to address concerns that we have about loss of habitat, et cetera, in the state. If you look at what these other states are doing, and we're only one of two states in the Southeast that do not have a trust fund similar to this. We hear Louisiana's working on it, so we may actually be the last. Let's hope that's not the case. But either way, though, if you look at what's happening in the other states, they're leveraging their state money on the federal level and doing some very, very significant projects. Imagine spending $50 to $100 million a year on wildlife habitat. I mean, every single year, nonstop. Imagine what we could do to address some of our concerns. So anyway, let's move over now to, we have a good group, James Cummings from Wildlife Mississippi, Alex Littlejohn from the Nature Conservancy, and Ed Penny from Ducks Unlimited. But I want to move over to Ed now and just ask Ed, Ed, you heard what I said going into the break just a second ago. There's a real opportunity for us now to address a concern that all of us have had about loss of habitat. I mean, this is a really big issue for Mississippi. We're not just talking about ducks either. It's just in general, loss of habitat is a big deal, isn't it?
It is a big deal, and we look across our state and we see a lot of economic growth, and that's good, and that's creating jobs for Mississippians and the folks in our communities. And unfortunately, we're also seeing some losses of habitat with that, and the two are not mutually exclusive. I want to be very clear in saying we can have economic growth, we can have new opportunities, but we can also protect and conserve wildlife habitat. We can also have clean water. We can also have a lot of public access to natural resources. And in all the states that I get to work across the South, and in places that do have a trust fund like this, there are good economic growth opportunities, there are good paying jobs, and there is an excellent quality of life in those places with an Outdoor Stewardship Trust Fund. And we all know that natural resources are a foundation to our economy. They're a foundation to our way of life here, and this is a great way to help make sure that we have the same opportunities for our grandkids that we've been able to enjoy for our whole existence here in the state. So, this is a great opportunity, and it's great to see senators and House members no longer questioning whether we need something like this in the state. 75% of Mississippians support this. And now it seems like our elected officials are listening to that, and they're no longer questioning it. They're asking about what projects would look like. And we talked a lot about legislative details and in the weeds conversation today, and we want to make sure that folks are focused on the most important thing, and that's what this will look like when it gets done, because it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So I'm excited to see where this is headed.
Well, in coastal Mississippi, I mean, it could, there's so many great examples. This could be putting a reef program, for example, on steroids. If you look I spent some time in Alabama, so I'm familiar with what they're doing. And if I were to take you on my boat and turn on the GPS, you should see if not thousands of numbers I have off the Alabama coast. One of the most aggressive reef programs in America right there in Alabama. Mississippi has done okay in that area, but if you compare the number of available reefs to what's happening in Alabama, it doesn't even compare. That's just an example of what could happen. I want to make it clear too that I'm not a member of any of these organizations. I'm not a member of any conservation organization. I don't own land that could benefit from this. I lease the 3 farms that I lease up in the Mississippi Delta because I love to hunt. But what this has given me an opportunity to do is see the unique relationship I have with my farmers. And I've said oftentimes on SuperTalk Outdoors, I can't imagine going forward without having the relationship I have with the Dunn family and Lee Abraham, who we lease land from. I can't imagine what it would be like. I see the role that the farmers are playing in this conversation. But as it relates specifically to the Outdoor Stewardship Trust Fund and the federal money that's available to us, coming over to James Cummings from Wildlife Mississippi, the Farm Bill is the big one. I mean, there's no doubting the fact that if we could have a dedicated funding source in Mississippi that would give us our matching fund component, that we could go get big dollars from the Farm Bill, and that's all private land. And by not having it, we don't get it, and that's an issue. The farmers are just. Oh, and by the way, before you mention that, when I was having this conversation with the ag commissioner last week, Andy Gibson, he had a map behind him. And in the Delta, you could see all the row crops in Mississippi, and it was all kind of dark green. And the rest of Mississippi was light green. It's sort of indicating where private land was. And, this could be, timber farming or whatever. It's incredible how really compelling that map is. When you look at that map and you see the amount of private land there is in Mississippi, we need to have access to that Farm Bill, don't we, buddy?
Absolutely. We're missing a tremendous amount of dollars just in private lands alone. It's $6 billion a year. Some of the smaller sub programs within it or matching grant programs that we don't have an opportunity to go after. And I've heard some people say, well, they don't want to see some wealthy person pay for their food plot or duck hole. Well, totally, I'm in agreement with that. This past Saturday morning, I was able to join 34 African American landowners to talk about the Farm Bill and how they can, it was out of Madison. Congressman Thompson was there for about 15 minutes. He had a date with a hog hunt, smart guy. But you had a number of landowners that they don't have access to these funds. They're not wealthy. They've been discriminated against historically. So how can we help them? And without a trust fund, without matching dollars, it's going to be extremely difficult.
Yeah, I mean, again, I've come back to this many times, but since 1985, the 2 most incredible best practices by the federal government as it relates to wildlife habitat is the CRP and WRP programs. I mean, this is nationwide a serious best practice, huh, James?
In 1.6 billion to Mississippi's coffers. 1.6 billion.
Wow.
It's incredible. It's improving the lives. It's creating places, to take kids to go hunting and fishing and watching wildlife. It's about quality of life. This is about making Mississippi better to attract economic development. As Ed talked about, they're not mutually exclusive. How can we use conservation to make this a better state for everyone?
Alex, when you and I talked on my show, Coast Views, really a terrific visit we had a couple of weeks ago. One of if you look at the Farm Bill, there are a lot of sub programs inside the Farm Bill. They cover a wide variety of uses. But you actually mentioned one. You guys did a comparison states that have a trust fund as compared to Mississippi on just one program. Tell me again about that.
Yeah, James mentioned one of the sub-programs inside the Farm Bill, and there are numerous ones. This particular one we looked at with James and Ed and others was the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And when you look across the states that have a trust fund set up, they're gaining every year about $6 million. James, correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, you as well. But they're getting every year on average about $6 million. Well, Mississippi is getting from that same program about $300,000. So right there, we're leaving $5.7 million right there. Now, you take that one program, you multiply it across 10 years, and just in one program, we're talking about almost $60 million that we're leaving on the table. One program. James and Ed and others and I sat down and said, okay, let's look at some others. And without going into details on each one of those topics, we came up with about $40 to $60 million every year that Mississippi is completely not competing for, not gaining because we don't have a trust fund set up. Well, you take that 40 to 60, you times it across 10 years. Now we're talking about $500 million. And as everybody knows, if you're out there on a WMA, a National Wildlife Refuge, a state forest, if you're hunting and fishing those areas, you see the needs. I mean, you can't not be on these places and not see the needs. I mean, if you're standing in at Mahana and don't get drawn, you used to be able to run up to Delta National Forest and go try to shoot a duck in Delta National Forest or try to harvest a deer or shoot some squirrels, whatever it may be. But you can't do that right now because the needs at Delta National Forest aren't being met. But again, you look back and you look across these programs, $500 million over 10 years is significant. We can move some serious needles with that kind of investment if we had a trust fund set up here in Mississippi.
Very, very significant. Boy, that gets my attention. And that's why the federal matching piece and the fact that the Farm Bill is the majority of the federal matching piece, and that includes private land. I wish we'd quit having this conversation that pits landowners against non-landowners. That's really not very productive. And again, wildlife don't know property lines. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with my great cast today. Love having this particular group with us, and we'll continue the conversation about the Outdoor Stewardship Trust Fund. See you after this break.
We live in one of the best places in America to enjoy the outdoors. So let's talk about it. It's Super Talk Outdoors with Ricky Matthews on SuperTalk Mississippi.
It's kudzu walls and fall football, a Gulf Coast sunset, and a deal.
Welcome back to Super Talk Outdoors. I have my friends James Cummings from Wildlife Mississippi, Ed Penny from Ducks Unlimited, and Alex Littlejohn from the Nature Conservancy. Ed, let's come to you real quick. I was thinking about what James said a few minutes ago about, this notion that a landowner is rich is really kind of a false notion. I'm sure that some landowners are rich, but there are a lot of landowners in Mississippi who are not rich. In fact, they may be land rich, but they really don't have the resources to do what they need to do from a conservation point of view. And this is what this is all about. I might also add that they don't just take the money, they got to do something in return. So talk a little bit about that, Ed.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, landowners come in many shapes, forms, and sizes in our state, and we go to church with them. Their kids are on our baseball teams. We went to school with them. They're folks we know, and these folks are paying taxes. Typically, families have land. They may have some pine trees on their property. They have some pasture land. They've got a few cows on it. These are landowners that we know. And unfortunately, because they are paying taxes, they're paying all kinds of bills. They need some help to do conservation work that's needed on their property. That's treating invasive species like Kogon grass in South Mississippi. That's keeping wild hogs off their property through federal funding and programs like that. They're doing prescribed burning to benefit turkeys or quail and to help pine trees grow better. So the federal programs that James and you have talked about and that are available, they're for doing things. Folks are replanting trees. They're they're selling their farming rights when they do a conservation easement through the Wetland Reserve Program. They're restoring wetlands at their own expense and then getting reimbursed for it. So these folks are doing the work on the ground that supports clean water, that supports wildlife habitat, that creates public access and even huntable wildlife populations for a lot of us to enjoy. So, I kind of recoil when we talk about rich landowners, because they are not all like that.
In fact, most aren't. So, Alex, what would you add to that?
Again, and I feel like a little bit of a broken record. You've got to, when you look at conservation, you've got to look at both private and public lands, and they are mutually beneficial to one another. Wildlife do not know property boundaries. They don't know boundary lines. They don't know any of that. They know habitat. So that when you can provide habitat on both public and private lands, the benefits are incredible, as if you were just going to do it on public lands. It's just, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. If I walked in and told my dad that I only mowed 20 or bush hogged 20% of the pasture, I can tell you it wouldn't end well for Alex Littlejohn growing up. and much like your yard today, if you mow 20% of your yard, it doesn't make sense. It just absolutely, you've got to look at conservation holistically. Now, Ed and James and I do it because we're in this world every day. It's just innate. It just comes to, it's just what we do. But to pit public versus private when it comes to conservation is just, that's not productive, and that's not being honest with what the needs are and the issues are out there, as well as the opportunities we have. And these are once in a lifetime opportunities that we have before us over the next few years to really land some of this money in Mississippi like we've never seen before for conservation. And when I tell you like never before, as you alluded to, James has written a couple books. We've never had this kind of money before as he was writing those books. This is a whole nother chapter in conservation in ways that we never thought possible. And Mississippi, there's no reason Mississippi should be sitting on the sidelines at this moment in time.
So James, boy, what a great tee up for you as we start to wind down our show together. But what closing thoughts do you have about that?
So, to follow up on what Alex and Ed were talking about, this argument about wealthy landowners is not new. The United States Congress, and it's signed into law. When you sign up or you apply for a conservation program, there are income limits. If you make too high an income, you can't participate. So that ship has sailed. We're already doing, we have those safeguards in place. So I'm excited about that. If I was legislator for a day, Ricky, and I had a blank sheet of paper, I'd write on one side all of Mississippi's conservation and recreation needs. I'd look at the next column and I'd write down what funding sources are out there that have the greatest leveraging opportunities. And then I'd tailor our stewardship fund to try to achieve the most dollars to hit the most needs in the state. That's simple to me, but I'm confident we've got some very passionate leaders that, in that are elected officials, and I'm confident we'll find a pathway forward, and we won't go another year without funding parks and private lands.
We're the capital of the outdoors in the U.S. I say it every week on this show. We have to act like we're the capital of the outdoors. Wildlife habitat is a huge issue for the state. This is an opportunity to address that. So I hope that you have enjoyed this conversation. We're going to continue to talk about the Outdoor Stewardship Trust Fund until this thing passes. And until next week, join me and enjoy a conversation with Will Primos. And I'm going to invite Senator Neil Whaley to join me. Hopefully he's available. And we'll continue the conversation. Until then, we'll see you next week. And stay safe, like I always say. Stay safe in the outdoors. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks.